Hi, my name's Mark, and this is the Service Design Show, episode 241.
There's a simple two-word questions that we as service design professionals need to constantly be asking ourselves. So what? We create the blueprint, we map the journey, we run that workshop. So what? What does it actually mean for the customer? And more importantly, what does it mean for the business? That question and that journey to find a compelling answer is the central puzzle we're going to try and solve today. It's about moving past explaining our process and finally embedding our value in a language the rest of the organization understands. Hi, if you're new here, welcome to the Service Design Show, where we invite the brightest minds in our field and explore what is truly needed to design services that resonate with people, push businesses forward, and honor our planet. Our guest today, Mark Howell, had a pivotal moment in his career when he took a 2-year stint in management consultancy. It was there that he learned to connect design to the hard realities of business cases, strategy, and profitability. Essentially, he was doing service design before he even knew what to call it. That experience of rooting design in business value has shaped his entire approach, from leading large teams to a surprisingly therapeutic hobby of stacking logs, which he describes as a satisfying puzzle. His journey from a design practitioner focused on the front stage to a design leader who understands the entire system gives him a critical perspective on how we can finally answer that question, so what, for our own stakeholders. So in today's conversation, you are going to learn about actionable strategies for making an impact even in low maturity environments, how to spot the red flags that signal a project might be set up to fail, why the challenge of explaining our value often lies in the system, not you, the crucial role communication plays in building your resilience and doing sustainable work, and the one conversation you must have to align your work with business outcomes. What really stuck with me was Mark's honest story about being sidelined on a project where he felt unwelcome. I think it's a situation many of us have faced, where we know we can make a difference, but the conditions just aren't right. The real challenge is knowing when to keep pushing and when it's time to find a different battle. There's a lot of hard-won wisdom in this chat with Mark, so let's get right to it. I'll catch you at the end for my personal takeaways. My name is Mark Fontein, and you are listening to the Service Design Show. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
This is going to be one of the most confusing episodes if we start calling each other by the first names. But yes, there is an actual Mark and a Mark here. So this will be interesting. Mark, before we dive in, I quickly want to set the stage for the puzzle that we are going to try to solve together throughout this conversation. I think a lot of us who are listening will recognize the situation where we are in a meeting with stakeholders, or maybe even at a networking event, a birthday party, and sort of we have an insight or we see an opportunity and we try to communicate that. And the receiving party just looks at us with glazing eyes and like, what do you do? I think that is one of the most frustrating elements of being in the service design space. We spend so much time explaining, trying to explain what we do instead of just doing the work and actually creating the value. I've been in the service design space for close to 2 decades, and this is a conversation we're still having. We're going to see if we can find some clues to this puzzle to come up with not just maybe answers, but actually a strategy to get over this and move into doing the actual work. I think your experience in service design is definitely going to be helpful there. So if this is our puzzle, Mark, then I'm really curious initially if we explore and look into the problem space, what is your take on the fact that we are here on, in this case, a Tuesday morning at late 2025, and we are still having this conversation about how to explain what we do and how to position ourselves. Why are we still here?
Yeah, it can be frustrating, and I think it can really distract from the value that service design can bring. I think the mindset, the tools, the methods, we know that's valuable, and we can see the potential to apply that in organizations. But I think we risk becoming a bit redundant if people can't quickly grasp like who we are and what we do and the problems that we solve. So I think maybe one of the initially confusing things is, I think, just talking about service. I mean, what is service, and how is service different from product? And I think that becomes, or it can end up being, a bit of a rabbit hole to go down. You don't want to have that conversation, really. You want to just, what you can do, the value of what you can bring, and you get caught up in these conversations about, okay, so product designers do this, service designers do this. There is a bit of an overlap, but we kind of have complementary skill sets across the design process of discovery and design. And I think, coming into organizations, there's the question of, where does service design start and end? Where does product design start and end? How is a service designer different from an ITIL service designer? I've been in organizations which have never had service design, but have had ITIL service designers, which are more kind of, I guess, technical service designers. They're called service designers. So you walk into the organization and everyone thinks you're one of those, but you're not. You're a human-centered service designer. And yet again, you have to say, okay, well, this is how we're different. And I've been, I set up a bit of a side project when I first started in one of my recent organizations to kind of map out side by side, what is the difference between what we do as human-centered service designers and ITIL service designers? Because there are similarities. We're both trying to improve services, sometimes technical services, but we take very different approaches. So you kind of get caught up in job titles, and I think when you do that, it just becomes a distraction from like why you're there and what the value is that you can bring. So yeah, maybe it's the name. It could just be in the name. I tend to nowadays just talk about customer experience. Service design is a set of tools and methods, and we apply that to improve customer and colleague experience. And boom, straight away, you're talking about customer experience, and that's what people understand.
Let's cycle back for a moment to what you said. Understanding the difference between services and products, understanding the difference between service design or human-centered service design and ITIL service design. Like, one could argue that, come on, we've had over 20 years to actually figure this out. Like, those questions, haven't we answered those questions already? And if we haven't, what makes you confident that we will eventually be able to solve that if we haven't cracked the nut in the last 20 years?
I think we have cracked the nut internally. So service designers amongst themselves, they know the answers to these questions. So I know the difference between an ITIL service designer and a human-centered service designer. I know, or I have a point of view on where service design plays and product design plays and user research plays. But we're walking into organizations where people are doing, well, people may never have worked with designers before, and they maybe don't care about the fragmentation of design. They don't really want to know too much about why they need a content designer, service designer, product designer, user researcher. They just have a problem they want to solve. And there are large organizations which are very kind of technically focused and maybe are very early in their product journey. I mean, maybe they've just recently adopted the product operating model and they're thinking very much in terms of products rather than services. It's almost like the the pre stage before you think in terms of journeys is thinking in terms of products. So I think there are lots of systemic reasons that we haven't cracked the nut. We know as a community of practice who we are and what we can do. That's not to say that our stakeholders and organizations are set up in ways which allow us to, you know, deliver on what we like our strengths, I guess. So it is frustrating. It's sometimes it's kind of to some extent it's in the name, but it's in the organizational structure. It's in the fact that um, people don't necessarily care about the 5 or 6 different types of engineer that you might need to be able to build a product or a service. So why would they care about the 5 or 6 different types of designer you need to bring in to kind of release and test and launch something end to end? So I think I think they're sort of probably some of the reasons. And yeah, it can be frustrating, but I think sort of starting small, and getting advocates in an organization is massive. People that kind of get it, who are then allies, and then you can sort of build out from there.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, we as a field, as a community of practice, have a pretty good understanding of the value we can bring to the organizations, the problems we can solve. We have a pretty good understanding how we do it. But the challenge we're running into, as you said, isn't necessarily with what we do or how we communicate it, but the context that we start engaging with isn't receptive or isn't set up or isn't interested in the value that we bring. And if that's the case, if that's my correct sort of summary, then like we are up for a really long journey because systems don't change really quickly.
Well, I think you're right. There's still going to be work to do. I don't think we can get away from advocate, like the kind of evangelizing side of what we do. I think that's going to be necessary. I think experience people experiencing. I think service design is one of those disciplines or processes. If you experience it, you get it, and then you're bought in, and that goes for stakeholders as well. If they experience the code, a design process, the facilitation that service designers can bring, the co-design, the rapid prototyping, the kind of understanding of the journeys, mostly they're really bought in to the process. But it's like trying to explain that up front in a way that they realize, okay, yeah, this is what we need and this is what we're willing to pay for. In terms of the way organizations are set up, kind of reflecting on my last few roles, I joined a big UK bank, and service design was really new there. And they had a director of transformation, and he was really bought into. So the bank was going through a large scale transformation, like multi-billion-pound transformation, and he'd identified service design, systems thinking, and agile as being the 3 disciplines that would really drive the transformation. So from a ways of working perspective, we need to move to agile, um, away from waterfall. From an organizational perspective, we need to take a systems thinking lens so that we understand all of the moving parts of the organization, how organizations interact with each other, what the incentive systems are that drive behaviors, because incentives do drive behaviors. So all of the kind of system constraints are really important because they can impact journeys. And then, within that broader system, what are the journeys? And that's where service design came in. So what we had there was somebody who reported into the CEO, who saw the value of service design and said, look, we need to set up a service design practice because that's going to drive transformation. We need to understand the journeys first in order to transform them. Then the organization was set up to really support that. So in terms of the org structure, we had value streams set up, which were collections of journeys. So you might have had like a value stream in the commercial part of the bank, in the retail for wealth. And within those, you had labs focused on journeys. And within those labs, you had multidisciplinary teams, you had service designers in there. So like the conditions were just perfect for service design to prosper because you had the right organizational structure, you had really high level support for what you were doing, and there was this kind of understanding that to transform the bank, you needed to understand the journeys, and service designers were the ones to do that. They weren't the only ones to do that, but they were the ones that became synonymous with mapping journeys and improving journeys, which was great because people started asking for more service designers, and the team just grew. So on every level, it was working. Not to say it didn't have a lot of challenges because you still come up against a lot of resistance, I think. We had business analysts in those labs, and some of the business analysts had been around for 15, 20 years. They had deep SME knowledge. They were great at mapping as is processes and to be processes. So when you came in as a service designer, they were like, okay, let's sit down and have a look at the to be process. And it's like, well, let's understand what it looks like now. Let's understand the experience. But they'd already jumped to a kind of functional version of what the to be should be. And it was almost like it felt like the train had already gone. You're just in there too late. It's like, okay, so what's the difference between the process and the experience? Do we really need to understand the experience? Can't we just design an improved process? So there was a lot of tension in there between service design and business analysis. I've seen that in quite a few organizations, actually. But I guess it's kind of, it's a bit of a threat sometimes to the work that people are doing. You walk in as a service designer, and you've got to be a partner and show the value by, working in partnership rather than saying, hey, look, we own this, we own the experience, because that's a much bigger question. Who does own the experience?
Thank you for sharing this example. There's much to unpack here. One thing that got ingrained in my mind is you said we needed journeys. So we needed to start to think in journeys. Somebody apparently on a high decision-making level understood that was a prerequisite. And then the question emerged, who understands their journeys, who thinks in journeys, and then service design, in this case, was the logical answer. What this reminds me of is the first point we started talking about is what is it that we're actually communicating and how are we positioning ourselves? So this conversation about the value of service design has been going through my mind, like I said, for the last 20 years. And I'm driving my car and I'm looking at business vans passing me by, and I look at the names on those vans, and I don't know, I see B2B logistics partner, and I'm like, I have no clue what this business actually does. But do they care about communicating to me? And if they don't, like, why do we as service design professionals care so much about this? But I think the message here is, if my problem is making sure that my packages arrive on time and that I'm able to deliver upon my promise to the people who are buying from my online store, if that's the message on the van, it makes a lot more sense if I'm in that context. And again, coming back to your example of the journeys, in this case, there was a clear main point. We need journeys, and who's going to solve that? You don't even actually need to know that service design is called service design, but you need people who do that. There is a caveat here, and I want to get your perspective on this because I talk to a lot of service design professionals, and the problem they encounter is that they get pigeonholed into one specific thing. Often it has to do with, okay, we need to facilitate a workshop, you're the workshop person, or we need a journey map, create a journey map. So instead of actually doing service design, they're making a journey map or they're facilitating a workshop. So, like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think we can get pigeonholed, and we do get pigeonholed as being the service blueprint people. So, in the example I was talking about, in the large bank, if you turned up as a service designer, the expectation was that you were there to, do a blueprint. So sometimes you don't need to do a blueprint. Sometimes it's not necessary. Um, so I think there's so much more that we can bring, but the way to understand something and compartmentalize it is sometimes to reduce it to a method, and then you can think, okay, well, they're here to do that. In terms of some form of governance or checkpoint, we can say, okay, yep, we've got our as is blueprint, so we can move on to, define, on to design, concepting, and doing some concept design. So there, and some governance, I think some governance processes that I've seen, design governance, do actually have, a long checklist of outcomes and artifacts. So yep, we've spoken to customers, we've got our blueprint, we've reviewed all the existing research, and it becomes like a sort of tick box activity. But um I think it's about kind of, sometimes it's about positioning as well. So it's about kind of positioning and elevation. So you can, and I think if you're a service designer that gets hard coded into a product squad around a product, probably product management are paying for your time, and they want you over here because there's some sort of mapping to do and some journey work to do. So you go in, and sometimes you've arrived too late, and it's very hard for you to kind of see why you're there. And that's happened to me as well. I've been sort of sidelined. I've kind of walked into an environment where I wasn't really welcome, or I'd arrived too late and just kind of felt sidelined. I was constantly looking for an angle or a perspective or an opportunity to bring value. Um, so in that situation, if you can't walk in there and do the service blueprint, then what are you there for? And you end up sort of being there for a while until people think, well, actually, do we need you, or do we just need a business analyst to start, writing some user stories? So it's kind of about positioning and elevation. But the way that a lot of companies fund design roles is that you're funded by a product and you're in a squad, and that can really constrain your ability to look across multiple journeys, because those other journeys are happening in other product labs or squads. And as much as you can see the opportunity for you to think, hey, look, I can really see that we could build an ecosystem here by connecting up these products, or this product intersects with this journey, it's not really your remit to do that, because you're not being paid to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to just sort of attend your stand-ups, do your blueprint if it's needed. And if not, then what are you there for?
Mm-hmm.
Of course you can, be the user advocate, but yeah. So I think it's kind of like, where are you positioned? What level of elevation do you have in the organization? What level of understanding do people have of why you're there? Do you have you been paid for 3 or 6 months? I've been in a situation where I've been, as I mentioned, in a, like, it paid for by a product, wasn't particularly, it wasn't the right place for me to be. I tried to map journeys, I tried to facilitate workshops, I tried to channel all of my superpowers as a service designer of facilitation and orchestration, but eventually I just end up being sort of sidelined, and it didn't feel good at all, because I knew what I could do and I could see some opportunities. but I ended up literally not, not being able to bring value. And I went to my manager at the time and I said, look, I'm not being effective here. I need to find another opportunity. I need to move somewhere else within the organization where I know that I can really have an impact. And I think it's kind of, for a while you feel like you've failed, but then when you move on and you're successful, you think, wow, the conditions there were just not right for me to actually have an impact.
So,
But
so I'm curious, like, what have you learned from that experience of being in a place where you are, I don't know, not welcomed or not being utilized, or and then going into a context where you are able to sort of fulfill on your promise? What did you learn from that experience?
I think you've got to pick your battles. That's one thing. You can't you can't just keep pushing. If the I mean that we've got a really broad toolkit as service designers, so there's lots of things that we can try. But ultimately, if you've tried everything you can to get traction and it's not working, then you may need to just move somewhere in the organization. And everything can change. Like the conditions are completely different, and you can move on. I think so. Yeah, I think sort of picking your battles and realizing that you're not going to win them all. Sometimes you just won't be set up for success. Knowing where to focus your energy is important. Don't take it personally. In some of these environments, they can be very political. There's SMEs that see your presence there as a threat to their kind of hard-won knowledge. So there may be some resistance there. There's egos, but at the same time, there can still be quick wins that you can be proud of. So you might not get the kind of big strategic change that you're after, but I think even sort of focusing on the smaller wins can be you know can at least make you feel like you're taking those steps forward. But yeah, I think one of the I can't remember the name of the systems. Think about I think 90% of performance is actually down to the system conditions and the system constraints, and 10% is actually your performance. So you can be the best service designer there is, but if the system conditions are working against you and you're not set up for success, I'm not saying there's little that you can do, but you need to just step back and think, okay, I've got the relationships. I've tried a number of different approaches, but something's not moving here. Maybe the timing's not right.
Mm.
Maybe I need to come back in 6 months, or somebody else needs to step in.
Like the experience that you shared, and when you now reflect on it, it's easier to identify that the conditions weren't in place. I can assume that when you did start out on that assignment, you were sort of hopeful, optimistic, positive, excited that they invited you in. Moving into new positions, and maybe when sort of running your team now, like what are the red flags for you that signal, okay, like now is the time to, like you said, pick a different battle? And how do you know when to keep going, and how do you know when to step aside and find something else? Because I think that's the very difficult thing. We're always optimistic, we're always positive, and we want to change things for the better, and like stopping feels like giving up. So what are those red flags?
I think some of the red flags can be listening listening closely. I think sometimes for me it's like listening closely to my team, and kind of understanding if they've been in a product or a portfolio, and they're having a hard time, and every time I speak to them in a one-to-one, they're still having a hard time, and then
What
they
does it
start.
mean, hard time? Like, what does it look like?
I think it's a number of things. It's they haven't so they've got aggressive stakeholders, um, stakeholders who maybe are still working in a previous way of working. So, for example, organizations adopt different operating models. You can go from a kind of you can adopt a new product operating model. You can move to like a journey based operating model, and I think every time an organization does that, it needs to change. And it's the people in the organization that need to change their mindset and their ways of working. Sometimes stakeholders pay lip service to that. They're like, oh, yeah, this is great. Totally bought into the new product operating model. We need to go out and get enough, customer insight, de-risk. And it's basically they're saying all the right things, but behind closed doors, they're still in the old mindset. And sometimes they're leaders within the organization. So I think for me, this is a real kind of red flag when you've got stakeholders that aren't bought in and aren't open and willing to try new ways of working, because service designers typically are coming in to kind of change ways of working, mindset, bring together silos,
Hmm.
improve collaboration. But if you've got leaders that are resisting the change, that kind of filters down. So that's one red flag. So I think when you go into a part of the organization that's kind of got those type of leaders in place, that can be a hard place to be, because they'll say the right things, but actually they're not supporting change. So that can be a red flag.
Are you able
So
to spot that up front?
I think it kind of comes through. Sometimes you hear about it through meetings, and you hear about it through back channels. But sometimes it's actually like with the one-to-ones you have with your team when they describe the behaviors and how people are behaving. It kind of becomes clear that they're resisting the change.
But
So I
that's
think
in
that
hindsight, right? That like you want to hopefully not even get into those situations where the odds are so stacked against you that like there's no way you're going to win there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the question about when do you pull somebody out? That's what I'm thinking. So if somebody's in there trying their best but not getting traction, at what point do you say, okay, let's pull them out, let's try them somewhere else? And I've had people in my team getting burnout, and I think that's kind of prolonged exposure to very challenging conditions and challenging stakeholders, and kind of a passive aggressive kind of environment where agree to your face, but actually behind closed doors, it's a different story. So I think I guess if you're talking about more of a like a predictor, like how do you? So there's two things. There's the way something looks before you go in, and then you've had a service designer in for 2 or 3 months, and they're still having a hard time. At what point do you know at what point can they sort of step out and leave? I think something else that I think is really helpful is to get a good sense of the product, the maturity of the area. So maybe I'll do a bit of a kind of a sidestep here and talk a little bit about a kind of a quality assessment that I designed with my team. So I I had a large team of service designers, and I was accountable for quality, but there's only one of me, and I didn't want to be a bottleneck for quality. So how could I get on top of the quality of work that maybe 40, 50 service designers were doing? So I designed with the team a process that allowed us to kind of really get on top of quality. And there were sort of four key indicators of quality.
Quality
The
of
first one,
what? Sorry to interrupt you.
quality. So it's very much a kind of a craft level assessment. So when you talk about service design quality, you can talk about how well it aligns with business outcomes, customer outcomes. But this was more an assessment of the craft of service design work that people were doing. So are they actually doing work to the right level of quality against a certain number of factors and criteria? And then that became a predictor of the quality of work that was getting done, and the extent to which they were actually contributing towards OKRs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we came up with a number of different indicators. There was like the methodology. Are you following the right method? Is the method sound? Outcomes. Are you supporting the right outcomes? Have you built the right stakeholder relationships? And then also personal reflections. So what have been your personal reflections on the work that you've been doing and the environment that you're in? And the reason I'm mentioning this is that this quality assessment process was meant to be a very open conversation that service designers could have to talk about the work that they do, the methods they're following, the kind of relationships they've built, how well the work they're doing aligns with the problems that they need to solve. But the conversation really changed depending on the level of maturity of the product that they were in. And some product areas had very, very low maturity. Literally, they'd never done any customer insight work. They didn't even know who their customer was.
Mm-hmm.
They'd never worked with designers. So the kind of stories that service designers were telling in those product areas were very different to the ones that people were telling where they were in somewhere where maturity was much stronger and more established. So if you had a low maturity of like a 2, then sometimes they were struggling to build relationships. They were kind of maybe doing work that wasn't playing to the strengths and weren't aligned with outcomes. So it was, I guess, as a predictor of success of service design, you could almost say running an assessment of the design maturity of that area of the organization is to some extent a predictor of the effectiveness of service designers. So design maturity you can think about in terms of like the operational setup, the people, the partnerships, the practice and capabilities, and the value and impact measures. Do you actually have those in place? So yeah, it was very telling because before the conversation started, you would know, okay, they're in somewhere with a 2 or they're in somewhere with a 7. It's going to be a very different conversation depending on that level of design maturity. So yeah, to kind of circle back to your question, I think in terms of red flags, low design maturity, not to say you shouldn't go in there, but someone's got to go in there and start, trying to change things. But it's not going to be as easy as somewhere with a 7, with a very kind of established design maturity.
That's really interesting to hear about like this assessment. And what was going through my mind is we don't, at least to my knowledge, we don't have like an industry-wide standardized quality benchmark assessment that you could use to sort of have an honest conversation with your stakeholders and say, listen, this is what we as a service design industry know about doing effective work. If I fill in these questions, we end up with this situation. Know or be aware of the fact that this will lead to these types of outcomes. I haven't seen a tool like that that we can use across the whole industry. And like the result is that I think a lot of professionals don't even or aren't able to well articulate what it is in their context that they need in order to be effective. It's like running a restaurant, but not having a good sense of I don't know, how often do you need to buy your supplies? Like, how many chairs do you need? Like, you don't, like, you sort of have a grasp of what a restaurant looks like, but you don't have the deeper understanding of the mechanics. And in this case, they aren't necessarily the mechanics of the craft of how to do a good journey map, but rather the conditions that need to be in place to get to those results. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is the actual reason that I got the team together very early on. In one of our quarterly, we have these kind of quarterly get-togethers where the whole team gets together face to face. We spend an afternoon learning something new, celebrating success, and or working on something which was a really important initiative and foundation for our practice. And early on, I went in with a really simple question and asked, how do we improve the consistency and quality of the work that we do as service designers? Because product managers were coming to me. I'm accountable for quality, and they're saying, well, I'm paying for this service designer. How do I know that the work is being done to the right level of quality? Because there's so many people from different consultancies, different backgrounds, and I needed to give them and myself the reassurance to know that I was connected enough to the work that it was actually being done to the right level of quality against a consistent set of criteria. So we did a workshop that afternoon, and there are so many different factors that contribute towards service design quality. You could say it depends how well you've been onboarded into the organization. It depends whether you know where all of the shared templates and artifacts are. It could be that you know when the service design critiques are happening and you attend those so you can get feedback on your work from your peers. All of those things are important contributors to quality. But the one I really wanted to focus on is, how do we design a framework which allows us to have a conversation around the really important elements of service design? And we came up with, as I mentioned, like the four indicators, and then there were six discussion items. And I'll like the discussion items were problem alignment, sustainable design, inclusive design, timing and capacity. So have you got enough people, the right resource? Community collaboration. Are you taking advantage of all of the opportunities to get feedback from the community, critiques, that sort of thing? And then there was one which is, have you followed up on the actions from the last check-in or the last quality assessment? And the great thing about this was that it became a predictor of quality rather than having like a gated governance process where you get to the end of your empathize and it's like, oh, I've ticked the box for service blueprint, I've ticked the box for user research, I can therefore move forward to defining my problem. This became a predictor of high quality work, and in fact, it led to 90% of product managers rating service designers' involvement as critical to them being able to meet their OKRs. So it became a framework which allowed me to scale quality assessment beyond myself. It removed me as the bottleneck, and it just gave a consistent set of criteria that we could use to kind of really have a good conversation, get under the surface of the work that's being done, and allow people to get peer feedback on how they could approach things differently. And to your point at the beginning, one of the bits of feedback, because we did a number of retros on this process. There were lots of things that weren't good about it to start with. I mean, it was very cognitively hard for a service designer to jump into a completely new domain and understand the work that's firstly understand the domain, understand the work that somebody was doing, and then give kind of critical feedback on it. Some areas of the organization, it's generally known that probably 3 months is the onboarding time you need to really get your head around this domain because it's very technical. But you're suddenly jumping in and having to get in like get on top of that domain very quickly in order to be have a sort of critical perspective. But one of the bits of feedback was, what does good look like? I'm
Hmm.
doing this work. Actually, I'm kind of assessing this other service designer's work, but what is my North Star of good? What does good look like for service design? And that's a kind of a harder thing to define. We kind of know when we've been there and we know when we've done it. And maybe the way to define that is to come up with a case study that was really impactful and, you know, increased customer customer satisfaction, massively reduced, redundancy, improved efficiency, all of those things. But it's kind of hard to point at it, whereas it's kind of easier to point to a great, UI, I guess.
Well, I think you hinted upon what good looks like, and there is a proxy, and I really liked your sort of the KPI that you introduced. Would the person who's paying for your time hire you again the next time? Like, does the product manager find your involvement critical in the process? Whatever the outcome of that specific project was, right? Would they hire you again? I think that's a really good proxy for how effective you are.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this a lot, to try to figure out how could we actually get some data on this. And it just kind of came down to let's ask the product managers. So
Yeah.
every 3 months, I used to have a meeting with the product managers, and every 3 months, I would give them a very, very simple question. Not like it doesn't take 5 minutes to answer it. It takes like 1 minute, which is how how would you rate this? How would you rate the contribution of the service designer to you being able to achieve your product outcomes? And it was the highest was critical, and the lowest was uh not relevant, or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
was some
Yeah.
almost not relevant. And I got so much feedback on that
A
question that
brilliant
enabled
question.
me to
Yeah.
kind of give a kind of a rating of how the team were doing across the board. And knowing the design maturity of an area, if a product manager gave a low score, it gives you that additional context that you need to sort of say, well, I see that you've rated them as kind of average contribution, but I know the environment, and I know some of the challenges because I've heard that in the, as part of the service design assessment. And I know that you being a 2 or a 3 in design maturity is means that the openness to working in this way, and maybe even having the right kind of work for the service designers to do, may not be in place. So it gave me that context, so that it wasn't like, oh, you're not doing a good job because the product manager's only rated you as an average. It was like me saying, well, I understand why it's an average.
Hmm.
Let's see what else we can do to help them on their journey.
I want to do a quick pivot into something that you've mentioned a few times already. You're currently leading quite a substantial team of service design professionals, and you mentioned quarterly check-ins. You mentioned the word community. Um, can you tell us a little bit more? How important is community in your perspective to doing effective service design work?
Yeah, I mean, community is. I think this is a nice kind of. This question flows really well from what we've been talking about, because we've been talking about um, quality, and we've been talking about how sometimes it can be quite challenging to have, to be a service designer working in some types of product groups. And for me, the reason that I am very strong on community is that I want to have a safe space for designers to come back to, where they can speak the language that they speak, feel a sense of belonging, and feel that they are with like-minded people, because you're not always feeling like you're with like-minded people. So for me, community is very important. And the ways that you build community are often around the kind of rituals that you have. And I think they need to sort of change as you evolve the practice. I mean, for me, you know, when I think about communities of practice, it's about people, purpose, and practice. So people, like who are you designing this practice for? Um, why why do people need it in their lives? People are busy. They've got a lot of work to do out in delivery. You need to give them the why factor. Like why should I engage with this community of practice? Um, and then often the reason for that is like why are we here? What's the purpose? Um, why no, how do we define our value proposition? And then just building out the practice. Generally, if you build a practice, it is useful for service designers because you can share information, you can share methods, tools, you can give access to kind of shared repositories. But I think more than anything, it's been the rituals that we've put in place that have really kind of driven community. And the rituals I would talk about would be everything from one-to-ones to quarterlies to like a talking circle. I've even kicked off this new meeting within the team. It was actually somebody suggested it to me. I had these 13 initiatives that I was working on with the team to kind of build the foundations, everything from like service architecture to AI to measurement, all of these things I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to try and build and mature. And one of the initiatives was around well-being. And somebody from the group said, "Oh, there's this meeting called Talking Circles, and it's kind of got its origins in the traditions of indigenous people in North America. But basically, you get together as a group, and somebody holds an object, and they start talking about something that is topical or important, like managing change, for example, was one of the topics. And somebody talks for 5 or 10 minutes, nobody interrupts, and then you pass the object to somebody else and they talk, and people are listening, they're deeply listening, actively listening, and connecting with what other people are saying. I didn't attend these. My team actually initiated the talking circles, and the feedback was really, really good, and it really helped people to kind of talk about important issues. But I think that's on one end of the spectrum. So sort of self-initiated rituals, which I was fully supportive of, all the way through to the quarterlies, which when I came into my most recent organization, there was there was just a large group of service designers with no community. Somebody was running a service design meetup once a month. I think one of the contractors was running a service design meetup once a month. Side of desk, they had a mural board that they were kind of using to structure the sessions. But in terms of if somebody asked, what do you do? What are your offers? What's your value proposition? You get 50 different answers, and that was a problem. So I started up the quarterlies to focus on building some of these foundations, but more than anything, it was to start with because this was during COVID. People were like, "Oh, you're meeting new people. Oh, you're a service designer. Okay, great, good to meet you." So it was the physical connection. It was learning together. It was celebrating success. So in the run up to those quarterlies, I would ask the whole team, could you nominate somebody who has gone above and beyond or who you really think deserves recognition? And I would just kind of create a slide um, with their name and the recommender and what they said about you. And I would kind of give out these pieces of paper. We did laminate them to start with, but then I thought that's not very sustainable because it's just going to go straight in the bin and you can't recycle it. But there was something about it being like a laminated slide that felt more like an award. But just taking the time to recognize and celebrate success was really kind of great, and people would, applaud and cheer. So I think having those rituals really helped. And at some there was a tipping point where you suddenly felt like you were part of something, a community of people who I wasn't driving it myself. And that's always been part of my definition of a community of practice, that it shouldn't be necessarily led by one person. It should be driven by the members to some extent.
Great to hear this example of how a community is helpful. I've been bought into the idea as well. And like you said earlier in our conversation, if you're doing service design, you're bringing change. Like that's the thing you're always going to bring to the table, and bringing change means that you're going to meet resistance. Like change is about solving resistance, and therefore you have to have a lot of resilience to bounce back and to sort of stay mentally sane. And it's really hard to do that on your own. And it helps a lot if you have people who are going through the same journey, who are also fighting the same struggles. I've learned that community is really essential to do service design in a long-term, sustainable way as a professional. And I guess that's for everybody who's bringing change, but we are. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, we started our conversation talking about, okay, man, can we finally step away from those conversations about trying to explain what we do to actually doing the work, and sort of stop obsessing over definitions, maybe stop talking about our process and start talking more about the outcomes that we bring. You have been in fortunate positions where sometimes the context was already in place and you were set up for success from the get-go. Let's assume that most of our listeners aren't yet. Now they walk into the office the next morning after having listened to our conversations. What do you feel is the first step they should or could take to improve their situation?
I think probably the best first step you could have is to walk straight into the office and get some time with your product manager or leader of your squad, and understand what are your what are the metrics, like what do they care about, what are they trying to do. Because as soon as you understand, I guess, the objectives and key, we talk about objectives and key results where I am now, and it's actually really enlightening to understand the kinds of results that you're there to try and drive. And it and if you understand them and you understand how you can contribute towards them, then you're pushing in the same direction, rather than like trying to push for something else and ending up getting sidelined. So I think having that conversation about, understanding why you're there, and what you can do, and it's about making the decisions about what you decide to do to be able to contribute best towards those OKRs. There's no getting away from it. You're there for a reason. They're paying for your time, and better to be pushing and collaborating and partnering it towards the same goal than feeling like you're not quite sure how you're having an impact. So I'd probably say that would be I mean, you're probably doing it anyway, but sometimes, in my teams, I just, in a one-to-one, I would say, so what are the OKRs? Just tell me, like, what are the three main OKRs? And most of the time people know, but sometimes they don't. And that's kind of a surprising thing when you don't know. And I've started to run these monthly OKR sessions with my team, where we've got all of the products, all of the designers, and the OKRs. And I think to start with, it felt like a really dry exercise. Everyone, like, nobody said anything the first time I did it. Everyone was just like staring at this massive Excel spreadsheet I was kind of working through, and I don't think anyone particularly enjoyed the first session. But as we started looking at how designers were helping to move the OKRs, or we could start to celebrate some successes, and then it was like, okay, yeah, we're getting some momentum here, and the whole team can see what they're doing. And it wasn't just about product OKRs; it was about laddering up to more broadly, like what the organizational OKRs and the organizational strategy. And very quickly and quite easily, often you can see how the work you're doing ladders up to broader organizational OKRs, even if they're high level, like improving digital maturity by 1 point, reducing capex by 400 million, or whatever they are. If you can see how you're contributing to that in quite a small way, then you're moving in the right direction. So yeah, that's probably the main thing I'd say.
And when you know that, it makes for a much easier story at a birthday party, right? Instead of talking about service design, talking about I'm contributing to 400 savings on our capex.
Yeah,
That would be
yeah,
that will probably get you into more interesting conversations. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, cool. One final question I have for you, Mark, is we like to end these episodes not with an answer, but rather with a question, because when you have the right questions, the answers often become quite obvious. So, what do you feel is a question that's worth our time pondering on when we're done listening to this?
A question that's worth our time pondering on. Okay. How can you reframe service design as to be more connected and more outcome focused, to be more connected to business and more outcome focused? And that is that's like a key shift that maybe we need to think about, because we don't want to lead with methods. We don't want to lead with we don't want to be like, the last thing we want to be is like accused of doing post-it note theater. We want to be there to have business impact. So and language is so important as well. I think the language you use can turn people off immediately and alienate people, or it can be like, oh, hang on, this person actually kind of sounds like they know what they're talking about and is interested in what we're doing here. So I think language is incredibly important. So how do we reframe from kind of a methods based approach to more of an outcomes based approach, and what is the right language to use to do that? And it could be language around what we're called. It could be language about how we speak about the work. And I think always in our heads, we need to be thinking, so what, so what, so what? Like, so what? What are we doing? Like, we've done all this stuff. So what? What does it mean for the customer? What does it mean for the business? And if you're not always thinking about the so what, you can get a bit lost in process, I think.
That's already a good question to think about. So what? I'm going to plus one you on that one. And my additional question would be, what is the subtext that's going to go on your van? Like if the van says Mark Fontaine service design, like what's the subtext that's going to go below below that subline? Uh,
Um,
and you don't have to answer that right now, obviously, but that's what I'm going to think about.
Design what matters.
Making businesses more profitable. That would be maybe
Yeah.
one of the ones that I would leave comments, people. Please leave comments. We would love to know what's going on in your van as well. Mark, thanks so much for sharing your experiences, your stories. That's what we need. Not theories, not frameworks, but things that you've actually tried, done, seen, and you've brought a lot of that today to us. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me on, Mark. I've really enjoyed the conversation today.
For me, the solution to our puzzle really came together in 3 steps. It starts with finding alignment by truly understanding the business goals our stakeholders are measured on. That gives us the clarity to reframe our work around impact so we know what good looks like in their eyes. And because that path is never easy, we're reminded that we can't go at it alone. Our community is our greatest source of resilience. I want to thank Mark again for taking us on that journey. If you enjoyed today's conversation, you can do me one big favor. Click the like button on this video and leave a short comment if you haven't done so already. Not to feed the algorithms, but to feed me and let me know whether or not we are on the right track by addressing topics like this. Finally, before we part ways, please take a moment to reflect and celebrate that by joining us today, you've directed your attention towards learning and growing as a professional. So, from everyone who you are going to impact through your work, thank you for taking the time and making the commitment. My name is Mark Fontijn, and I look forward to having you with us again for a new conversation on the Service Design Show. Take care and see you soon.